Right, it's always tempting to keep waiting for more and more people to join us, but I can see there's already a good number of people on the call. And thank you very much for those of you who are here on a timely basis. So my name is Brinsley Dresden. I'm a partner at Lewis Silkin, head of the Advertising and Marketing Law Sector Focus Group. And today is a double header with my colleague and partner, Garrett Lloyd-Taylor, who's the deputy head of the Advertising and Marketing Sector Focus Group. So welcome from both of us. And Garrett, if you can bring up the next slide. So today's session, we've divided broadly into 4 sections. The first section, I'm going to be talking about why this matters, why the new Green Claims Code is significant. And then Garrett and I will be doing a tag team approach to running through the 6 principles which underlie the Green Claims Code, doing them alternately one each. Then Garrett's going to be talking about the new ASA announcement, which followed swiftly on the heels of the Competition Markets Authority's announcement about the Green Claims Code. And indeed, we are going to be threading some of the ASA's decisions through our discussions about the new Green Claims Code. And then finally, we've left some time for questions. We hope that there will be some questions, and we will take them at the end, but you can put your questions at any time into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. So as we go, you can please feel free to do that. So I think it falls to me to open up with, why does all of this matter? Well, I think by virtue of the fact you're on this call, you're probably not a climate change denier. And therefore, I think we can all agree that the main reason why this matters is because of the climate emergency, which is a phrase that I think a lot of people don't really dispute anymore. And the starting point, if you like, is that the United Kingdom has committed to a target, a legally binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. And then in the much more immediate future, we've got the COP26 summit coming up at the end of October. And that in itself has also been a driver for this new development and the publication of the code. The starting point, though, if you like, for this goes back to November last year, when the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, led a review by the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, which has a dreadful acronym of ICPEN or ICPEN, depending on your preferences. And they reviewed the green claims on 500 websites and found that 40% of them were misleading. So the conclusion was there's an awful lot of bad practice going on at the moment. It also, I think, indicates that this is a kind of whack-a-mole type process, and that the regulators are never going to really be able to stamp out all misleading claims, but they have to start somewhere. So the CMA has said that their strategy is to, they've been working on this code now for about 6 months. They published the draft version, and then a couple of weeks ago published the final version. Very little changed from the draft. It's a very good document, very comprehensive, a little bit of repetition, you might say, in the way that they've approached it, but you can learn a huge amount by reading through it. They are then, in the beginning of next year, so in the beginning of 2022, they're going to be conducting a full review of misleading green claims, both online and offline. And that's really going to include some of the areas of traditional media which are within the Advertising Standards Authority remit. So they're not mutually exclusive, these remits. But one of the key things, and one of the main reasons why this new code matters, is because the CAP code enforced by the Advertising Standards Authority doesn't apply to everything, whereas the CMA's remit does apply to those things that fall outside the CAP code, so particularly point of sale material, packaging, and labeling. So my best guess is that the CMA is going to sort of concentrate its energies on dealing with misleading green claims in packaging and labeling particularly, and they're going to leave claims which are within the ASA's remit to the ASA to deal with. in terms of an efficient allocation of resources. But that's not an absolute rule, and there's nothing to stop the CMA picking up and dealing with a claim in advertising if they feel that it's merited. They've said that their initial priority in terms of sectors is going to be textiles and fashion, travel and transport, and fast-moving consumer goods, by which they're talking about food and drink, beauty products, and cleaning products. So those will be the initial points of priority, but it's important, I think, to note that that is only where they're going to start from, and that they will work out from those. And also, again, if they come across something particularly egregious, which isn't in those categories, that's not going to prevent them from taking action. The market, of course, I'm sure many of the people in our audience are going to be familiar with the Advertising Standards Authority and will know that the ASA's main sanction is adverse publicity and reputational damage. The CMA enforcement, however, is going to be something that has to be taken even more seriously because they can require legally binding undertakings, which is what we've seen in the way they've dealt with influencers. Also, ultimately, they can take either civil or criminal action and levy fines. And so we'll have to see, but one would expect that they might want to start making examples of bad actors and even imposing fines. So it's just going to be a much more muscular enforcement, I think, than we're used to. The other key point, and really the last point I wanted to make in this section, was that you've also got to consider the impact on your stakeholders. So it's not just about reputational damage with your customers, but also with your shareholders and your employees if you're found guilty of greenwashing. And we know that there's likely to be an increasing amount of competition for talent, particularly young talent. And so when you're competing in the market for your employees, a company that's been found guilty of greenwashing by the ASA or by the CMA is perhaps going to be at a competitive disadvantage when you're trying to recruit. And my partner, James Davis, one of the joint heads of our employment team, has published a very interesting article about the impact of climate change on the employment side of life. And that's available on our website if you're interested. So those are the sort of opening remarks. And so now I'm going to hand over to Garrett, who's going to talk about the first of these 6 principles.
Thank you, Brinsley. Yes, and welcome from me as well. This is a run-through of the 6 key principles that the CMA have put out there as being at the heart of their guidance. And the idea is not to trot through these in a way that's abstract, but to maybe give them a bit more context and a bit more life for you. They do overlap to quite a large extent, but we can have a look at these examples and we can draw on others as necessary. So the first principle, environmental claims must always be truthful and accurate. And this one seems blindingly obvious, and I didn't think there'd be much to say about it, but actually there's quite a bit to say about this one. The main point to say is that the test always is under the consumer laws that the CMA apply and under the CAP codes that the ASA applies, this issue of materially misleading the average consumer. So that is still the test, nothing has changed. And I think in some of this guidance it sort of sounds like the CMA sometimes puts an idealized approach forward, which might not always be to everybody's taste, but that is always going to be the benchmark that they're aiming for. Anything beyond that goes too far, and a court probably wouldn't agree with them. So we're looking at whether it materially misleads consumers, and obviously claims have to be true. The other point about it is that the impression given, the overall impression given by claims, whether on packaging or in advertising or other sort of point of sale materials, websites and so on, do have to give an overall impression which is truthful and accurate. It can't be too selective in the way that claims are presented. And it's probably useful to look at a few examples. So here are some examples that the CMA calls out. Made from recycled plastics. That claim might be true, but it might be made out of 50% recycled plastics, and then the rest of the plastics might not be. So it might be true in some sense, but not in the overall impression. So that sort of claim would probably not be acceptable under the new guidelines. And you would have to spell out to what extent you're using recycled plastics, to what extent the rest of the plastic isn't recycled. Claims like recyclable also are something to look out for. So is it completely recyclable? In which case that's probably okay. But do you have to recycle it in a particular way? Do you have to bring it back into the store, for example, to be recycled? It can't be put with your household recycling. If that's the case, again, it's not true necessarily or accurate that it's recyclable, because there are further sort of conditions that apply to that and caveats. The same is true of claims like organic. So in the context of food in particular, you have to have a certain threshold. It's usually about 95% of the content has to be organic in order to use the claim organic. And in different sectors, there will be lots of specific rules that apply. And so that's true of sort of food. The claim organic is sometimes used in relation to clothing as well. So do think about whether every element of the clothing is genuinely organic. If they're a pair of jeans, for example, it might be made of not just the denim, but the dyes that are used and all sorts of other factors, the rivets and the buttons and anything else. Really look at the full picture is the message from the CMA. And claims like eco-friendly, I think, are probably going to be the riskiest, and sustainable. These very, very broad claims. They're the ones that are probably not going to be true in the CMA's eyes, unless from cradle to grave, start to finish, there's a sort of net benefit to the environment if you actually selling these products and the consumers consuming them, which is usually not going to be the case. So often it's about making quite specific claims rather than eco-friendly. In what way is it eco-friendly? And we'll have a look in a moment at different principles that draw in other elements of that around the sort of cradle to grave approach. The other final point to make on this one is in relation to claims like now with reduced plastic packaging. This is a claim that you see all the time. And the CMA calls out a specific example in the guidance that's quite helpful, which is to say, if you were to create a yogurt pot, for example, and you want to say it's with reduced plastic packaging, you put a leaf on the packaging and say it's reduced plastic packaging, and it's reduced by about 5% of some nominal amount. And in the same process, you actually have to move factories, open up a new way of doing things, and so on and so forth, so that actually the net benefit has been cancelled out. Then it would be misleading, even if it's strictly true, to make the claim now with reduced plastic packaging, because it gives an overall impression of a net benefit when that might not be the case. So I'll hand over to Brinsley to take you through the second principle.
Thank you, Geraint. So the second principle is that environmental claims must be clear and unambiguous. And one of the things I wanted to sort of draw out was the deliberate, the intended overlap by the CMA between their green code and the ASA's long-established code and guidance. And of course, it would be slightly bizarre if they contradicted. So it's helpful that they're consistent. The CAP code, the relevant rules say, for example, the basis of environmental claims must be clear. Unqualified claims could mislead if they submit significant information. And there's another rule which says the meaning of all terms used in marketing communications must be clear to consumers. So you can see there's a definite correlation, consistency between those two rules. Now, Geraint, if you could bring up the next slide. So one of the other things I wanted to do was to talk about some actual ASA decisions, which provide some guidance, I think, as to the way in which these issues might be interpreted, but also, some of the pitfalls. So this is quite a recent adjudication from the 9th of June this year about this Hyundai car, the Nexo. One thing I did notice in the adjudication is that it doesn't describe the image, which is a bit odd because normally they do. And I think when you look at the image, there's a couple of things I would draw out. One is that because the woman is on the treadmill and in the bubble, connected up to the exhaust pipe of the car, clearly the car is stationary. It's not moving at all. In fact, at first I thought it must be on a rolling road, and then I thought, oh, well, no, actually, it doesn't even need to be on a rolling road. It's just stationary with the engine running, and the athlete is doing the actual running. So you can see the key claim there was a car so beautifully clean, it purifies the air as it goes. This is a website ad. There was only one complaint. The point about this particular vehicle is that it is a hydrogen-powered car. So it produces electricity by combining oxygen and hydrogen in a fuel cell, and then that provides the power for the car. And there's a credible school of thought which will say that the kind of electric cars which are, everybody's buying at the moment are actually a sort of intermediate technology. And in the longer term, the answer to our transport needs is going to be hydrogen vehicles, because unlike a current electric car where you've got to get that electricity from somewhere, and often it's going to be a nuclear plant, if not a coal-fired plant, with this, you don't have that requirement with this kind of technology. So one person complained to the ASA and said that the claim was misleading and couldn't be substantiated. And the point they were really making was that the car will still produce particulates both from its braking system and from tyre wear on the road. Now, the substantiation for this claim, and bearing in mind this is my point about the fact that this car isn't moving, the car has a filter that removes 97% of fine dust and gas, including sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide, which are the ones that we worry about in London, and we have our new clean air policies. And then it's got an air purification system that removes 99.9% of very fine dust. And that cleaned air is then put into the fuel cell, and then the system expels the purified air, which is why you can then pipe it into where the athlete is doing her running, and she's absolutely fine. So the ASA decided, however, that they were going to uphold this complaint. They said that the average consumer would understand this claim to mean that the car has a negligible environmental impact, and that they hadn't taken account of the particulates from the tyres and the brakes, and therefore the claim was misleading. Now, I have to say I'm very troubled by this decision, because one point of the policy that the CMA has expressed is that they want to encourage companies to invest in new technologies so that they can then make green claims, but do so in a way which is not misleading. And it seems to me that this is a kind of angels on pinheads kind of interpretation. There's no evidence that the average consumer would understand this to mean that the car has a negligible environmental impact. And I would have thought we should be encouraging manufacturers to produce hydrogen fuel cell cars and encouraging consumers to buy them. So I think that this is an overly fussy interpretation, and it does point out that there's a lot of uncertainty when you find yourself being subject to an ASA investigation. An awful lot depends on who picks it up within the ASA, what their attitude is, and also how good you are at presenting your substantiation. And we'll see some contrasting decisions as we go through. But this one was one that I thought was troubling. So Darren, over to you for the next principle.
Sure. So the third principle is that you mustn't omit or hide important information. So there's nothing groundbreaking in these principles. It's just they're useful to sort of address your mind to these. The kind of important information that I think is relevant in terms of green claims, though, is quite specific. So the CMA is mindful always of the impact on the environment, and it'll be affected by everything along the life cycle of the product and the supply chain. So the provenance of the materials, where they've been sourced from, have they been mined from the ground, and so on. The production processes, the practices employed in sort of transporting them around and actually consuming and using the product. And then what are they packaged in, how they're transported, and how they're disposed of. It's all going to be useful, important information if there is something along that chain which is going to cause some massive negative impact on the environment, that we're sort of shining a light on something else. So it's really a point of not cherry picking. The CMA specifically calls out the need not to cherry pick information in order to sort of distract people from less positive attributes. When it comes to presenting that information, the sort of ASA CAP guidance applies. So if you're going to include some disclaimer, for example, to qualify a claim, it should be relatively prominent and relatively close to where you're making that sort of claim. Sometimes space limitations might not allow that on packaging, for example, but the CMA is looking for people to introduce quite interesting, novel ways of presenting that information if there is genuinely no opportunity to provide it next to the claim itself. So they're suggesting the use of URLs, but also QR codes and whatever else to provide necessary information. It might not be a get out of jail free card though, because obviously if you're left with a misleading impression because you've left out some key information, that's still going to potentially mislead the average consumer. We're going to look at an example now actually of providing CO2 savings and making claims around carbon footprints in general, and doing so in quite a broad way. So let's look at this example. So some quite general claims, but here we see some impressive certifications. So Quorn has achieved carbon reduction footprint certification by the Carbon Trust, and there were some very general claims there around reducing CO2. The slightly quirky thing about this was that the claim seems to imply that if you consume this, you will be helping to reduce carbon footprint, your own carbon footprint. The claim actually meant that if you buy this product, over time, Quorn has committed to reducing its carbon footprint in relation to this particular product. And so carry on buying it and you'll be supporting that sort of activity. And that is part of the certification process actually for that particular certification that was shown. So this Carbon Trust certification is based not only on a reduction, an actual reduction in carbon footprint, but also on commitments made by a particular company in relation to various products. So Quorn argued that they had this certification, it was objective certification, and it did what it said on the tin in the sense that over time, if they save on their CO2 carbon footprint, then obviously we all benefit. We're all saving by choosing a product that has a reduced carbon footprint. The ASA though was not convinced, and they decided to uphold this complaint as well. So they argued that actually it's a brand new product, so you can't tell me that there is a reduction in carbon footprint over time because you haven't got the substantiation to that. And it isn't clear that what you're saying is that you're committing to reducing carbon footprint with this product. The implication is that if a consumer buys this instead of a competing product, they'll be making some positive step in the right direction in terms of reducing their own carbon footprint. And that didn't seem to be borne out by the substantiation. So the ASA did take quite a strict approach here again, and it was all about presenting information that's not entirely clear and leaving out quite important information. For example, this might have been better as an aspirational claim, or we are reducing our carbon footprint over time with this product, rather than choose this product, save the planet. I'll hand over to Brinley to talk about meaningful comparisons.
Yes, thank you. So again, you can see principle number 4 here. Environmental claims must only make fair and meaningful comparisons. And once again, this echoes really one of the existing principles of the CAP code. So we have the consistency there. And again, we can illustrate that by example. So Garrett's going to bring up this. Well, now this is for Plenish almond milk, or you're not allowed to call it milk, or the dairy producers get very upset, but almond drink. And there are a couple of these big poster ads, and you can see there, if you want to change to worlds, change your milk. And then the key claim, a recent study by the University of Oxford showed that the single biggest thing that you can do to reduce your impact on the planet is to switch to a plant-based diet. And then it has Plenish start somewhere. Now, I have to say, when I first saw this, I thought, partly because I've been reading up about the controversy about the use of the word milk by various producers of vegan substitutes, vegan alternatives, and the kind of fight back by the milk industry. I thought, oh, this is all going to be about the water consumption that is required to produce almond milk, I'm going to call it. And indeed, there were 2 complaints about the poster ad. Whoever the complainants were, they positioned themselves as consumers. And their complaint was indeed about the negative impact on water levels caused by almond production. Now, the University of Oxford, which my son will assure you is the UK's 2nd best university, have produced a large comprehensive study of the full life cycle of foods, which included meat and dairy and their environmental impact. And that's been studied, so there's, I beg your pardon, that's been published. So, other people have had an opportunity to comment on it and review it and criticize it if they want. And Plenish had then gone to the same team of people at Oxford and asked them to analyze their own supply chain for their almond milk using the same compatible kind of techniques that they'd used in their original study. One key point was that Plenish sourced their almonds from places in Spain and the Mallorca, I think, where there isn't a particular problem with drought. Plenish supplied the ASA with this full life cycle analysis, which looked at everything from the farm itself through the transport system and into the retail environment, and then also comparative data for cow's milk production in the UK and abroad. And the result was that the complaint was not upheld. The ASA agreed that this Plenish almond drink had a lower impact on the environment than cow's milk when you take into account the full life cycle of the product. So it is a fair and meaningful comparison. And also, I think they did note this idea of start somewhere. So it's kind of almost goes back to and overlaps with the point that Garrett was making, was they're positioning this as being a starting point if you want to kind of improve environmental concerns. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all in itself. So, Garrett, number 5.
Thank you. So yes, you've seen how these principles overlap to a large extent. I just want to mention an additional point on the full life cycle of the product. We've talked about all of the relevant sort of aspects of that. So where do all the materials come from? How are they sent to the factory? How are things made? How is it then distributed? How do consumers use it? How do they dispose of it? These are all important factors in terms of the full life cycle of the product. You don't have to spell out every single aspect of these. I mean, it's not about providing an essay with every product, because that's not going to be realistic. It's just about thinking, if you're making a specific claim, is it counteracted by some other element? And if you're making a very general claim, like sustainable or green, then we've had a couple of questions on this whilst we've been speaking, and those sorts of claims are really risky unless you can demonstrate start to finish that the product is fully green or sustainable in those sorts of ways. And it's going to be a really difficult uphill struggle to actually justify those sorts of claims to the CMA and to the ASA. So the general advice, I think, from the CMA is to avoid those sorts of claims in the abstract, and instead to try and find some sort of quite specific claim that you want to make and that you can stand behind. One thing that is relevant to understand is that during that life cycle of a product, there might be significant hurdles, or there'll be a sort of low bar and a high bar. So generally it might be sustainable in lots of different ways, but then there might be one fundamental element of it that's problematic. In electric cars, for example, the battery that is a rechargeable battery is quite enormous, and it's often made from lots of chemicals that are difficult to recycle and in some cases impossible to recycle. There is a focus increasingly on replacing those with recyclable materials, but manufacturers have taken quite a novel approach. So some of them, or most of them, will take the batteries back and they will find some other purpose for them. They will turn them into something that is a more future application. So when it's not needed, it doesn't end up in some sort of landfill. Not that batteries would end up in a landfill from a car. But that is the point, is that there are mitigating steps that you can take. And if you completely ignore an issue, actually it's worse than if you actually identify an issue and take steps to try and mitigate them. Because the ASA and the CMA will understand that you're doing what you can to mitigate those sorts of problems that are essentially unavoidable. And it doesn't mean you can't make environmental claims generally, it just means you have to be careful about those claims. So there are novel ways of dealing with the sorts of issues, and that's all I wanted to say about disposal, because that is quite a key point that I wouldn't want people to be put off, because there is one element of the supply chain that could be better, for example. It's not a complete barrier to making environmental claims. And Brinsley will take you through the final principle.
Yeah, so the final principle is about substantiation. Environmental claims must be substantiated. And of course, this is a long-standing requirement of advertising regulation in the CAP code. It's one of the basic principles that underlies all advertising and is also then reinforced specifically in the CAP code in relation to environmental claims. The basis of environmental claims must be clear. Unqualified claims could mislead if they omit significant information. Now, the first example I wanted to show you is this one, quite a recent one, relatively recent one from the beginning of last year. You can see the claims I've pulled out there. Europe's lowest emission airline and low CO2 emissions. Then also Ryanair has the lowest carbon emissions of any major airline, and that emphasis on major I've added because that's significant. So there were 167 complaints about this ad, which is a lot. It's a very large number, and I think it does indicate that the public are watching these. This is an issue that the public cares deeply about, and maybe because of public perceptions about Ryanair and Michael O'Leary, people didn't buy this. And it turns out they were right not to buy it. So the ASA investigated these claims. The problem was, in terms of this point about any major airline, was that actually Ryanair only had carbon dioxide per passenger kilometre for 4 other airlines. So that clearly didn't match up with this claim to be the lowest, so sort of superiority claim in relation to any major airline. The other problem was that they did have some substantiation, but some of it dated from 2011. So by the time of the investigation in 2019, the decision was published, I think, in February 2020, a lot of that substantiation was out of date. And in fact, the point about substantiation having to be up to date is something that's repeated again and again in the new CMA code. You can only rely on up-to-date substantiation. So the basis of the claims was unclear, and the evidence of the substantiation for the claim was not sufficient, and so the other complaints were upheld. I did want to compare that with this one, and I should declare an interest. Geraint pointed out to me that this is from 14 years ago, which is terrifying because I acted for EasyJet in the defence of this ad. We're saying this is a press ad that actually appeared in Newcastle, where there was a busy airport used by EasyJet and Jet2 in particular, competing in the market for package holiday makers flying to Spain. And you can see there are several elements to it. The first claim, 17 years younger than Jet2. Well, we could substantiate that. There's always data available that records the age of individual planes, and therefore it was possible to look at the age of individual planes. And Jet2's business model was to fly very old planes, whereas EasyJet's business model was to fly a very young fleet of planes. The second point was problematic though, because although the first part was true about the average age of the planes, the second part then, because our planes are younger, they are more efficient and less damaging to the environment. Well, that is one of those claims which is true, but there are other reasons that you have to factor in. It's not only about the age of the plane or even the more up-to-date fly-by-wire design of the plane. There are these other things like how many seats you've got, and that feeds into the load factor. In other words, on a percentage basis, how full is the plane and how many seats does it have? Crucially for me, the next claim, fly greener, fly EasyJet, the ASA allowed, for reasons that we'll look at in a moment. And that to me was a major victory for EasyJet, that the ASA endorsed that particular claim. And then the next problem was with the references to these two particular websites. The problem here was that because this was a comparative claim, the ASA insisted that the claims need to be verifiable by consumers. And the difficulty is that some of the substantiation that EasyJet used, which was fine, it worked, but you had to subscribe to these organizations to get access, particularly to the ATI website. It was only available on a subscription basis. And so the ASA said, well, in that case, it's not verifiable by consumers. So I think with the benefit of hindsight, probably what needed to be done was to pay ATI for a license that would have allowed the relevant data to be republished in a sort of summary form on an EasyJet website. But then this was the final piece of crucial data that you can see. So what we had to do was the airlines all use a particular software program to calculate how much fuel they will need to fly a particular plane on a particular route. And we got an expert who ran the data. The key things there, you'll see the EasyJet planes had a load factor of 87%. They also don't have galleys, so they simply have more seats as well as being more full. The Jet2 planes were less fuel efficient because they were an older design, but they also had lower load factors, and they were old-fashioned planes with galleys, so they had fewer seats. And then we looked at the three particular routes which both airlines were flying to and from Newcastle, and you can see that the grams of carbon dioxide per passenger kilometre were significantly better for EasyJet than for Jet2 on all three routes by an appreciable margin. And it was on the basis of this data and this analysis, which really was quite sophisticated and detailed, that EasyJet found that the ASA found in EasyJet's favour in relation to fly greener, fly EasyJet. So the next thing, I'm going to hand back to Geraint, and he's going to talk about the very recent announcement from the Advertising Standards Authority.
Sure, and to echo your point, Brinsley, it was in relation to the Quorn ad, there were 32 complaints on that as well. So there are quite large numbers of people complaining about these ads when it has an environmental issue involved. One of the other questions that we had, which we can pick up just now, just because we've dealt with comparative claims, is when we're talking about up-to-date information, in order to rely on the base a comparative claim, for example, or generally for substantiation, how up-to-date is up-to-date? And I think the answer usually is going to be, what is the latest data available? So if you're talking about data from back in, a year, 2, 3 years ago, there's probably going to be more up-to-date data available, and your claim should be based on the most recent available. If there hasn't been anything in the interim, at some point that information could still become stale. So I think it's important to keep revisiting claims to see whether it's possible to obtain up-to-date information or commission your own, whatever it might be. But as long as that claim is still meaningful and it's the most recent data available, I think you're going to be in a pretty good place. So just to mention on the ASA side of things, so we've looked in detail at the CMA and we've brought in some ASA related examples because they're both fighting on the same front, albeit that the ASA's remit is a little narrower than the CMA. The important developments from the ASA are to say that there will be updated environmental claims guidance published soon by CAP. We haven't got a date for that, but that is going to be, that is in the pipeline. The other thing they've announced, this is the ASA, is that they're going to be looking at specific sectors as well. There is a little bit of overlap with the CMA, but the ASA is committed to looking at sectors that the Climate Change Committee has identified as being particularly problematic. So aviation, cars, waste, animal-based foods, and heating are the quite specific areas that the ASA is going to be targeting. They're also going to be commissioning research because they're aware that consumers, they have a view as to what consumer understanding is of claims like carbon neutral, net zero, or even hybrid when it comes to hybrid cars. And we always argue that consumers should be given a lot more credit and that they understand a lot more than the ASA say that they do. And so they're going to commission some research in order to find out what do consumers really understand of these sorts of claims like green, like sustainable. And this issue of hybrid cars, it's a thorny one. So the ASA issued some guidance about a year ago into the use of the word hybrid, and they said that hybrid cars is a confusing term. And generally, it shouldn't be used without qualification, because is your car a full hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, a self-charging hybrid, a mild hybrid? There are all sorts of different flavors of hybrid cars. The ASA thinks it's going to mislead consumers to just use that as an umbrella term. So again, hopefully they're going to commission some research into that before they take any action or give any more sort of decisive guidance and guidelines in that area. And then they're going to identify other sort of research areas in early 2022. And I imagine they're going to focus on those areas that we've just been talking about: aviation, animal-based foods, heating, and waste. So that is the activity of the ASA. It goes hand in hand with the CMA, but with slight sort of variations on the areas of focus. Brinsley is going to take you through the key takeaways of everything we've been discussing today, because I'm conscious that we've covered a lot of ground.
Thank you, Garrett. So, yeah, the key takeaways. First of all, the CMA guidance is consistent with the CAP code and guidance, and there's the new guidance coming out. But that does mean that when you're trying to sort of work out a way forward and work out what you can and can't say, you can learn good lessons from the ASA, from their adjudications and from their published guidance. My own best guess is that in terms of sort of enforcement action, the CMA is likely to focus on areas that are outside the ASA's remit, because that would be an efficient allocation of resources between them. And the CMA does expressly say that they may well refer things back over to the ASA. So I think the CMA's focus will be point of sale material, but particularly packaging and labeling. The CMA's initial focus, you can see there, the ones as I mentioned before, but worth saying as well that, as Garrett mentioned, the ASA may be focusing initially on some other areas. But I wouldn't put too much emphasis. If you're in a sector, if you're in a company that's not in one of those sectors, I don't think you can afford to sit back and think it'll all be fine. It may take a little bit longer to get round to you, but also certainly the CMA are making clear that they'll come after everybody. I know the ASA is trying very hard not to simply react to complaints, and therefore they won't always just take up a particular case because there's been a lot of complaints about it if they don't perceive there's a major consumer detriment. But on the other hand, I think if somebody complains to them about an ad that's not in one of their initial priority areas, they would take it up if they felt that it merited being investigated on its own terms. In due course, the Competition and Markets Authority might impose fines. Now, I have to say, I think the CMA have been quite slow, for example, in the area of non-disclosed influencer posts, which are not disclosed as advertising. The CMA so far hasn't levied any fines on anybody. Whether they will be a bit quicker to start actually bringing criminal prosecutions, giving rise to fines, we'll have to see in the environmental context. But I think the reputational damage from even having to give undertakings to the CMA to cease and desist from making misleading advertising environmental claims will be even greater than it is when you have an ASA complaint upheld against you. And it's going to impact on the wider stakeholders and employees, as we discussed. For the ASA, we know they are now prioritising green claims. As we've seen with something like that Hyundai example, they do take a strict approach, and the burden of proof is on the defendant. One of the key restraining factors, if you like, on the CMA taking action to enforce the consumer protection regulations is that the burden of proof is on the prosecution, whereas with the ASA, the burden of proof is reversed, and it's the burden is on the advertiser to prove their claims. So you need to be stress testing your substantiation before you publish your claims, and crucially, you need to front load your defence. And that example by Plenish Almond Milk showed they had stress tested their substantiation rather brilliantly with Oxford University, and certainly the adjudication suggests they completely front-loaded their defence, and they've got the result that they wanted. Also, it occurred to me to mention that the Advertising Association, which covers brand owners and advertising agencies and media owners, is talking more and more about ad net zero and the way in which the whole advertising industry has got to try and improve its environmental credentials, and that will apply to production of advertising as well as advertising claims. I think there's going to be increasing pressure on brands to be green, and they're going to be then flowing that down to advertising agencies to say, well, you have to find ways of working now which are going to reduce the environmental impact of producing the ads that you're making for us. So that's going to be a whole change to the way of working, a little bit reminiscent of the way we've seen a change to the way people work driven by COVID. So finally then, what should you be doing now? Well, review your environmental claims now before the CMA review starts early in 2022. They're giving people a bit of a hiatus in order to make sure that they can substantiate their claims. And if you can't, you should be withdrawing them or amending them. And if you're planning new claims, you need to be stress testing the substantiation and making sure you're not making overclaims at this moment in time before the enforcement action really kicks off at the beginning of next year. So Garrett, I think we've now got questions. So do you want to take that most recent one?
Yes, so we've got one question lined up, which is, how does the CMA define the average consumer's understanding? Do they conduct research? This is at the heart of most of our debates with most regulators, to be honest. So the ASA will periodically conduct research, and that's why they have sort of taken that approach, because otherwise what happens is the advertiser says, we believe the average consumer thinks this, and the regulator will say, well, we think the average consumer thinks the other. And that is at the heart of most debates. So what will happen is that the CMA and others will conduct their own research into these different areas and have done during the process of bringing this guidance together. They won't always publish everything that they've got. They will also draw on third-party sources because there's a lot of research already out there conducted by all sorts of different businesses into what kind of understanding consumers have of different claims. But it is at the heart of most of these debates, which is, you know, one side thinks the average consumer has a degree of credibility and understanding, and the regulator will often underplay that, and it's an issue. The ASA conducted research into the understanding of, using Ipsos Mori, the understanding of consumers when it comes to disclosures, for example, and they will periodically refer to that, and I do expect them to do the same thing in this space. And perhaps share that information with the CMA, who can then rely on that to some extent. With the CMA, they bring prosecutions, but ultimately that's a prosecution that goes to the courts and you're allowed to defend yourself, and there's quite a high bar. So there is always a debate to be had that you know, they have to pull some information together. They can't just accuse you of doing something and set a low bar for themselves. That is an objective standard, this test of the average consumer and materially misleading. There's another question, I think, Brinsley.
Yes, what is the criteria of such research, and can research be criticised in defending certain claims? Well, certainly there's a sort of, in my experience, a kind of inequality, if you like, or inconsistency, because as an advertiser, if you have got some kind of research to justify your claims, you will put it in front of the ASA or the CMA, and it will be picked apart and often given to an expert who'll say, well, it should have been double-blinded, or the sample size should have been bigger, or whatever it might be, and that will all then be picked apart. Generally, with the ASA, they just seem to say, well, we think that the average consumer is likely to interpret the claim like this, but they rarely, if ever, then produce any audience research or customer research to justify those assumptions. They're just based on their own feelings. Ultimately, I suppose you could try and challenge that through a judicial review of an adverse adjudication, but that would be very expensive and very risky. And the bar is set incredibly high for judicial review, so actually very difficult to do in practice. So yeah, it's difficult. Your own research will be picked apart. If any research does exist which is being used against you, A, it might not be disclosed to you, and B, if it is, I'm not sure how much notice would be taken of your criticisms of it.
We've seen that with the Ipsos Mori research. I have to say the ASA's sort of blinkered approach when it comes to just using hashtag ad. I think there was a hope or expectation that the evidence that they were gathering would support that approach, but actually it doesn't really. There's a few percentage points in it when it comes to consumer understanding. So, you know, if an advertiser, as Brinsley said, tried to rely on the same quality of research, I think the ASA wouldn't accept it, but it's used often in reliance against advertisers.
I mean, it's probably worth saying, I do think it's a bit of an underused strategy in defense of claims, that brand owners can do it more. Certainly, I know we didn't act on it, but when Costa Coffee had a comparative advertising spat with Starbucks, they relied on consumer research to justify their claim that consumers prefer the taste of Costa. And that was submitted to the ASA, by the ASA, to an independent expert in sort of consumer research, who reviewed it and made some observations which were not all really endorsements, but ultimately concluded that basically the outcome of the research was robust and reliable, and they were successful in defending that claim. We did act for a furniture company, Oak Furniture Land, in defending a claim about no veneer in ear, which all came down to the meaning of the word veneer. And we did get some positive consumer research there to say that consumers would understand if you use the term veneer, you were talking about a sort of high quality thin layer of wood over a low quality base. And in the end, that helped us to win the argument, although it did take quite a lot of time and effort.
There's another question around these guidelines. If some people perceive them as being unreasonable or unworkable, what can you do about it? Well, I suppose businesses could club together and form a sort of joint view or objection to this guidelines, of these new guidelines. But the CMA has gone through a long period of consultation. They have adopted them. Their position is that there are consumer protection laws here that they want to enforce. Their interpretation of how to comply with those rules is set out in the guidelines, and they will start investigating businesses that fall short on that basis. And I think the pushback will come from individual businesses who are under investigation, frankly, and those will either comply and change their ways to sort of satisfy the CMA, or they can put the CMA to proof and say, look, if you want to take this to a court, so the court can decide whether we have materially misled consumers rather than just set out every piece of information you think is relevant, then we're willing to go through that process. It very rarely gets to that because people relent. They provide assurances in order to avoid that sort of level of that risk of prosecution. But certainly if you think that they've got it wildly wrong, that's where people like Brinsley and I step in and help you, because it's not always the case that you have to give up and give in to every point the CMA raises. You can argue back that, you know, these aren't materially misleading points. We've included the relevant information. We didn't need to put chapter and verse. It wasn't practical. There are all sorts of tactical, strategic, and practical ways that we can push back on the CMA and the ASA.
And of course, with all this kind of guidance, it is only guidance. It's not the law. And you can, you can not be consistent with the guidance, but still comply with the law. As you can say, overall, it's not going to be materially misleading. In terms, I mean, I have to say, having read through the guidance, I do think it's pretty good. And I mean, compared with the guidance that the Chartered Trading Standards Institute issued on price advertising, this is brilliant. And at least it's not just these high-level statements of principle, which leave you completely in the dark as to what you can and can't do. There is a lot of detailing here. So yes, you might find at the margins or in the actual, the devil will be in the detail. There might be elements that you think are difficult to comply with, but at least there is some certainty about what you're being asked to do compared with some of the other guidance.
There's also a checklist that the CMA has published, which is reasonably useful. That is, you know, it doesn't set out the level of detail, obviously, that the full guidance does, but the checklist is quite a useful resource. On that point, whilst we're taking questions, any more questions, if you want to in the last couple of minutes, just to mention, we do have resources available free for you to access. We've got this, which is our advertising law insights blog. That's the URL up there. We'll publish all sorts of updates on environmental claims, but all sorts of advertising, marketing related issues on this blog from time to time. And if you do want more bespoke training for your business, we can offer that as well, because obviously this will impact different sectors differently. It will also impact you differently whether you're an advertiser or whether you're designing packaging or whether you're just creating social media that might have a sort of shorter shelf life, for want of a better word. So there are different techniques and considerations, I think, for different types of businesses, even though the rules are meant to apply to everybody. So we haven't got any further questions. I wonder if we give people another minute. Brinsley, what do you think for questions?
Yes, if you'd like to throw in any final questions, then you're welcome to do so. I think one other thing I would just add to Garant's summary of the resources is just to mention, for those that aren't already aware, we are members of the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance, Gala, and Gala has produced guidance previously on environmental advertising. I think, to be honest with you, it might need to be updated, but it's a good starting point. And hopefully, COVID permitting, we will be having the Gala Global Conference at the end of March next year, 2022, in London. We were going to have it this year. In fact, we were going to have it last year, but the pandemic rather got in the way. But hopefully, it will be taking place, as I say, the last Thursday and Friday in March of next year. So we'll be sending out invites and information about that. And there'll be a big sort of half-day seminar taking place, hopefully at the Ham Yard Hotel, and then a party afterwards with a chance to meet lawyers from all over the world. So I think we are out of time now. So I think at the risk of sounding like the two Ronnies, it's goodbye and thank you from me.
And it's goodbye and thank you from me. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.